So today's class is about one of the more important arguments in the course. It's a fairly simple argument to understand, but understanding its implications and the way it's influenced contemporary philosophy will take a little bit more discussion. So in the Treatise of Human Nature, which was the original text from which the inquiry was drawn, Hume gives an account of personal identity. It's sometimes called the bundle theory. Instead of, and just as most of Hume is an attack on Locke's account of abstract ideas and the formation of complex ideas to come up with our ideas of God or of substance or causality, so he's going to attack the idea of a complex idea of the soul or the substance that binds together our particular moments of experience. Remember, Locke had thought that we form an idea of the self from the continuity of our memories. The stick-togetheredness of our memories provides our idea of our substance. And Locke is going to continue the progression of empiricism away from Descartes' idea that we have this immaterial soul that we can be completely certain of in the I think, therefore I am. So he says that we are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. One can't turn their sockets without varying our perceptions. He says the mind is a kind of theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, and glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. But there is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity indifferent, whatever the natural propension we may have to imagine that simplicity and identity. They are only the successive perceptions that constitute the mind, nor we have the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented or the materials of which it's composed. We'll see later that this was the source of the idea of a stream of consciousness that became so influential in postmodern or modern literature. So this is how we might boil down Hume's argument. All ideas are but copies of impressions, but when I examine the contents of my mind, my impressions, I can find only particular sensations and perceptions, this fear, this thought, this imagination, this memory. I can find no impression of myself, of the person that's doing the watching, or of anything that stands behind these various different perceptions, this stream of impressions, and holds them together. So since I have no impression of the self, there can be no idea that arises from it. So that there is no substantial self, but only the various sensations and impressions that I perceive. So Hume thinks that we have no idea of the self, and that if we asked where the idea of the self comes from, the answer we'd give, of course, would be Hume's constant answer. Custom and habit makes us come to believe that our various different impressions are connected up with one thing. So you can see Hume finally brings to a close the empiricist deconstruction. We started out with Descartes' mind's eye model, which had a mind's eye watching an internal TV screen. And we were so certain of the existence of this mind because we perceived it directly as sort of part of the room. But Hume is questioning that and saying we don't actually perceive this self directly. All we perceive is just the TV screen. And we never actually see the mind's eye doing the watching. So the self, which was at the center of our experience, now somehow disappears because we don't have any empirical perception or impression that corresponds to that self. We only have that stream of experiences. So this always reminds me of driving down a street, a suburban street at night, and you see televisions flickering, inside each of the living rooms as you drive down. Except for Hume, there would be nobody home. The lights would be on, but there would be nobody home to watch those experiences. Just as Descartes had argued that it doesn't make any sense to imagine conscious experiences without anyone that's conscious of them. So you might think, how can it be that we just have impressions without anyone that's aware of them? Remember Locke saying that an idea is just a name for a piece of consciousness, a piece of awareness, and you can't have ideas of which no one is conscious, of which you're not aware. Hume is somehow saying that we are just those streams of experiences without a separate soul or self that's conscious of them. And I think that nowadays we can imagine what such a system is and how it might be possible that our brain is one, now that we've advanced a little bit in artificial intelligence. So we can imagine a robot, which would just be a computer connected up with eyes and a body that would allow it to act. We can imagine that besides its external screen and its external input devices, it would also have an internal screen. Imagine that we took this screen and put another one, a duplicate, a mirrored screen inside the computer, and that we also took a webcam, an internal webcam, and trained it on that screen. So the inputs, maybe the stream of commands that it was performing, would show up on that screen, and there would be a camera that watched them, and then of course the input from that camera would go back into the computer's memory banks and perhaps affect the program. This is the model that many contemporary cognitive scientists give of how a conscious computer or conscious robot would exist. Douglas Hofstadter, the author of Gödel, Escher, Bach, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, wrote a book called I Am a Strange Loop that tried to say that human consciousness was precisely that. A strange loop is what goes on when you put two mirrors opposite of each other and you get this infinite reflection that you see here. Or he imagines that if you point a camera or a webcam and hook it up to your computer and then point the camera at its own output, at the own computer that's displaying what's coming in through the camera, you get a similar strange loop. This type of feedback loop is essential to all learning and all types of artificial intelligence. All of the computer programs that we have now, like Google Translate or various other artificial intelligence programs, actually learn by watching their outputs, watching their program, and then feeding whether those outputs work or not back into their program to change and alter their own program. They're not programmed by something else. They're programmed by themselves. So on this view, we are a strange loop. We're a computer that watches the outputs of our brain, of the computation in our brain, and then alters itself based upon that computation. So that's at least a sense of what it would mean to suggest that we are just a stream of experiences, just a screen with nobody doing the watching. We're a screen that, even though there's no one doing the watching, the inputs from that screen are somehow fed back into the content. And even just as the computer is not aware of its program, it just spits things out onto the screen. So if you asked, why do you come up with these ideas? Why do you make the decisions that you do? The computer would say, geez, I don't know. They just come to me. I'm just sitting there and all of a sudden it just pops into my head. In the same way, we have images and experiences popping up into our mind, and we decide to do things. And we think they're free, but they're really just coming from our brain, from our programs, in ways that we're not aware of, just as the computer isn't aware of its screen. So one of the most famous contemporary versions of Hume's arguments and of Hume's view of the self was given by the contemporary philosopher who's been at Tufts for most of his career, just in Massachusetts, who wrote a book in the 90s called Consciousness Explained, that attempts to give a scientific account of consciousness without the idea of a soul or without the idea of watching consciousness. And this is going to be a way in which Hume's model of the self, as just a bundle of perceptions, a stream of consciousness, is going to be part of the postmodern view of the self that sort of defined the shape of 20th and 21st century philosophy and thought. It's postmodern because since the people who are understanding consciousness, like Dennett himself, are conscious, and it's their consciousness that's making this study, in this case, consciousness is explaining itself, and in doing so, it actually changes itself. Dennett gives the example of Dumbo the elephant, who can fly only when he's telling himself, I can fly, I can fly, I can fly. And when the little mouse starts undermining his confidence and saying, well, how can you fly? It's impossible for an elephant to fly. At that point, it loses the ability to fly. So this is an example of that strange loop whereby our view of consciousness can alter the way in which we have consciousness and can change itself. And we'll see that that's part of the postmodern view of what the self is, that is in some way derivative from David Hume's bundle theory of the self and his deconstruction of personal identity. Now, I won't ask you about these theories and arguments of Dennett, but you might find them useful and interesting as examples of what Hume had in mind. So Dennett, like Hume, is arguing against the idea of the Cartesian Theater, that there's a screen inside your mind in one place in consciousness where all your ideas come together, and that there's a mind's eye in there watching, and that memories are just stored experience, and then there's a self that watches those memories. And Dennett is going to employ a series of arguments, like Hume's empiricist argument, to undermine that idea that there's one place in consciousness where everything comes together, and that there's a mind doing the watching. The first example that Dennett talks about is the strange phenomena of blindsight. There are cases where people's eyes are not damaged, but they become blind because of damage to their visual cortex. And in some of these cases, people can still use visual information even though they're not conscious of it. They don't have any visual conscious experience. The video that you can watch in the next slide shows a man who can't see, who is blind, but who's able to navigate this series of obstacles using information that they're not actually conscious of. Again, that's going to suggest that what we call consciousness is just a certain type of feedback loop that allows us to see what's going on in our brain, but the images and experiences in our brain are going on without us, and that what we call consciousness is just our way of interpreting those unknown features of the brain. Another example that Dennett talks about is what's called the phi phenomenon. You won't be able to see it here on this slide. You'd have to look at the actual slides that are on the PowerPoint, the link to which you can find. But the next slide has a video, which is an illustration of the phi phenomenon. In the phi phenomenon, you flash a light, a blue light, and then a little bit later flash a red light. And these two illustrations, if you watch the actual slide, would have blinking lights where a red light and a blue light flash, or a green light and a red light flash over here. This is similar to what happens in cases like this, where lights come on in succession and then go off, and you perceive it as a moving light moving around in a circle here. What's puzzling about this, according to Dennett, is that you see the ball of light moving across the screen, and at different times you see it in these intermediate places. But when it's a blue light going to a red light, you also perceive it as changing color over here. And of course, what's strange about that is that at this point in time, when it's changing color from blue to red, you haven't actually experienced the red dot. Remember, what's happening is only a blue flash and then a red flash, and your mind fills in the spaces in between with the motion, just as our mind creates motion out of the moving pictures, the moving static pictures in the films that we watch. And at this point in the middle, it changes from blue to red. And of course, at this point, you haven't actually seen the red one. So Dennett thinks that this shows that we're not actually getting a series of experiences, that consciousness isn't presenting images to our mind's eye, that in fact unconsciously we're constructing our experience from various different sources, and that somehow or other the information from here filters back to here, and what we call our conscious experience is just our reconstruction of that event that goes behind the scenes. In the next slide, you'll see a video of an example of the phi phenomenon. It's called the rabbit illusion because it's similar to another example that Dennett uses that's called the subcutaneous rabbit. This illusion goes on with touch. If you extend your arm out and close your eyes and then have somebody else, not yourself, somebody else tap 3 times on your wrist, tap 3 times on near your elbow, and then tap 3 times near your shoulder, instead of experiencing those 3 taps, then 3 taps, then 3 taps, just like the phi phenomenon, where you extend it into the regions in between, you'll experience 9 taps, a tap moving up your arm. They call it the subcutaneous rabbit because it feels like there's a rabbit running up your arm, because you fill in the spaces in between and spread those taps out along your arm. There's a second slide that has a video explaining the subcutaneous rabbit phenomena. And again, the puzzle is how can it change the in-between moments when it hasn't gotten to the end moments yet. In contemporary criminal justice and philosophy of mind, we recognize that our memories are notoriously unreliable. In fact, witness memory from memory is seldom admissible or seldom valuable in court proceedings because we so often construct false memories. And Daniel Dennett has a famous argument that is like Hume's argument. Hume argues that we can't see any self behind the scenes. Daniel Dennett's going to formulate a famous argument about false memories that suggests that we can't see the real picture of what's going on in our mind in these cases. So here's the situation that Dennett describes. We happen to see a person without glasses this morning with long hair. But sometime in the last week, we've seen a similar woman that had short hair and glasses, and somehow that contaminates our memory. So by the time we get to this point and remember what we saw this morning, we remember a person with long hair and with glasses. We somehow inserted the glasses of this previous memory into our experience. So that's what happens. You see a long-haired person without glasses. Because you saw a similar person with short hair and glasses, you misremember the person that you saw this morning as having glasses. And Dennett says there are 2 different interpretations of what's going on inside your consciousness to explain that. One he calls Orwellian because in Orwell's 1984 there's a revision of the facts. People go back and change the record. There are false memories inserted. So on this view, after you actually experience the person without glasses, a false memory is inserted so that when you try to remember it, you remember the person as having glasses. Equally plausible is what's called a Stalinesque revision, called Stalinesque because in Stalinist Russia, when they killed their political rivals, they would first have a show trial. In which they constructed a false narrative of what the facts were. This happens before you actually experience it. An entire false series of experiences is created and replaces the original experiences. So the experience you remember, now you remember it as happening at 9 o'clock, but now you remember it with glasses. And your memory of it as remembering it with glasses, the whole series is now fabricated and placed into your memory beforehand. Just in the same way, you wouldn't know, we've talked before, if you, as in Blade Runner, if you woke up this moment with memories of having a past life and having a childhood and having parents, if all you had were those memories, you wouldn't be able to distinguish between these 2 cases. The point that Dennett's making, just like Hume isn't making a point about what your real soul is, the types of arguments that would have caused different types of Christians to start killing each other in the 30 Years' War. Instead, he's arguing that we really have no conception of the soul or the self. So Dennett is going to say there's no way of telling empirically which of these two things actually happened in consciousness. So it doesn't actually make sense to talk about some magical feature of consciousness which stands behind our experiences. And this is similar to an argument from Ludwig Wittgenstein, the 20th century German and English philosopher. He moved from Germany to England and did most of his philosophical work in England at Cambridge University. That's called the private language argument that makes the same type of argument. In the private language argument, we're imagining someone on a desert island all by themselves trying to describe their feelings, and they say one day or record in their journal, I have the feeling E. And then the next day, they say, I have the feeling E again. And in this case, Wittgenstein argues that there's no way of knowing that the E you feel at time 17 is the same as the one you feel at 1. Of course, you remember it as being the same, but of course, in either of the two ways, in the Orwellian or the Stalinesque way, a false memory of what E felt like may have been inserted, or you may have reconstructed your original memory of E. So you don't know that E is the same. And this was the basis of Wittgenstein's argument. Wittgenstein was one of the sources of behaviorism. If you had psychology class, maybe you're familiar with this idea that all we know about our emotions are really their external signs, the things that we can observe. So both Dennett's argument and Wittgenstein's argument try to argue that there is no such thing as the special feelings of consciousness that are presented to the mind's eye inside our consciousness. Whereas Hume thought that our mind was just a stream of experiences, and we don't actually observe the consciousness. These more contemporary theories say our mind is just a stream of information in our brain that we're not conscious of, and we happen to reconstruct different stories of what was going on in our brain. But what was really going on was not any consciousness, but information processing in the brain. This was the source of Wittgenstein's famous beetle in the box analogy, or beetle in the box metaphor. If I said that I had a beetle in the box, you would only, and I didn't let you look inside the box, what was in the box would be completely unknown to you. It would be pointless to talk about what was in the box. You'd have to talk about it only in terms of that external behavior. So Hume says there is no soul, there's only the stream of ideas that we can perceive. And so the modern empiricists are going to say there is no consciousness. There is only the processing in the brain and the story that our mind concocts about that information. So this results in what Dennett calls a multiple drafts theory of consciousness that's based upon one of the central features of contemporary literary theory called narrative unity. In traditional works of literature, you would have a person with a set character, and then their character would determine their destiny, and the story would usually tell how they discovered their real self by seeing how they really responded to a set of obstacles, and their real character in self discovered itself, discovered what it really always had been through the process of going through this series of events. But in modern literature, like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, there began to be what was called stream of consciousness literature, where we don't get any access to the person's real character. No omniscient narrator describes what they're really like. Instead, we just get all the flashing thoughts and ideas, often irrational and not following any logical or sequential structure, of all their memories, all their thoughts, and all their passing illusions. And we have to sort of figure out what their self is. In physics, there's the idea of a center of gravity. it's an abstraction that doesn't really exist. All of the heavy objects in the solar system rotate around the center of gravity of the solar system, which is sort of the central place that is the average of all of the locations of the mass of all of those objects. So in the same way, Dennett says our self is something that we construct, a story we tell ourselves, a narrative that tries to explain all of the various different features and events and things that happen about ourselves. So nowadays we recognize that just like Dumbo, whose ability to fly was changed by what he thought about his ability to fly, we realize that our self is in some ways constructed by the process of making sense of our lives. So you can keep a journal or write poetry or write a memoir or see a movie or watch a movie about yourself. And the very process of writing your journal, the very process of keeping your memoir, alters yourself. In some sense, you construct yourself as a way of making sense of that series of images. So instead of the mind's eye already existing and seeing a stream of consciousness, we have a stream of different stories and different ideas and different sensations and different actions. And we construct, through a process of making sense of those various different streams into an idea of the self. So in some ways, Hume's idea of the bundle theory and that there is no fundamental self is one of the fundamental ideas of postmodern thought. We'll see that just as Hume's attack on causality sort of culminated modern philosophy and woke Kant from his slumber, and he's going to come up with a new revision of the basic ideas of modern philosophy to explain where causality comes from. Immanuel Kant is also going to come up with a theory of what he calls the transcendental ego, or the self, as an attempt to answer Hume's argument about how we come to our awareness of consciousness of itself. And in some ways, the central idea of Kant's philosophy is this transcendental self or transcendental ego, the I think that we can append to each of our thoughts. It's going to turn out to be a response to this central argument of David Hume.